History. History always is, at best, like this story, a chiaroscuro. The 23 Club by Edward Flaherty. Episode 7. Liwa Qsar. Rudyard Kipling, knowledgeable of Asian landscapes and their peoples, wrote, "This is a world of danger to honest men." Part 1. The Dream. In the West, the empty quarter has always been an elusive, an ambiguous froth, yet a strangely arid froth, whispering mystery and romance, providing an oddly attractive whiff from an evanescent bouquet of promise. That is the mirage, and Chalmers hoped that Liwa Qsar would be different. Spectacular red sunsets rewarded the end of every day. The project site was chosen to give the guests a luxury room looking west, a view framed by some of the largest and steepest red sand dunes in the empty quarter. The project was about providing shelter, a comfortable and elegant shelter, protecting from the uncertainties, from the threats in this beautiful landscape. Today, Chalmers would meet the key players constructing an iconic resort in the arid inland heart of the empty quarter, living and working in this sweaty 50 degrees centigrade world. Part 2. Kelvin Isley. Chalmers normally had little problem distinguishing between dreams, imagination, and the real-time requirements of building large complex projects. But today's Shamal had unsettled him. The drive to the project had loosened his focus, and there was an awkward aura beginning to emanate from this landscape. He was glad to be on the job site. He took shelter of what he knew, embedding himself in the reality of the construction process. Chalmers' first appointment on site was with Kelvin Isley, the CTF hospitality director. Kelvin was the final responsible, as client representative on site, to make sure that all construction happened to technical standard, to quality expectations, and on time. Kelvin was from New Zealand, following in the footsteps of his grandfather and great-uncle, who had spent much of their professional careers in the Middle East and North Africa. Kelvin stood a tallish 6'2" and weighed a fit 185 pounds. He had a friendly face. He was a direct man who knew not only how to listen, but also how to command and control to get the required results for successful, complex hospitality projects in challenging locations. Kelvin had obviously sun-sensitive skin, with a ruddy, splotchy complexion. His blondish hair looked like the sun was bleaching it, burning it off. But despite those sensitivities, he had an ingrained natural fitness. His natural fitness was the result of a childhood hiking in the New Zealand countryside, which built his lifelong capacity for endurance. His father was research director in the New Zealand Department of Conservation, Southland region. Kelvin grew up in Invercargill. His father made sure Kelvin knew, like his own backyard, the Rootburn and Milford tracks. And his father always took him to Maori meetings, where Kelvin absorbed the traditional insights these men had learned from the landscape. He was a well-organized, type A personality, and made good intuitive reads on people's personalities and their issues in relation to the goals and objectives of the project. He worked 12 to 14 hours a day at Liwa, and still had weekend time for his wife and 2 young kids in Abu Dhabi. While in the empty quarter, here and there each week, he hiked down into the Subka valleys, and up along the dune ridges. Whenever he found a free moment on site, he set out to know this unusual landscape by first-hand experience. He channeled the right side of his brain, listened to the empty quarter, heard the empty quarter, and became one with it. Over time, this had enabled him insightful observations on the life forces in the desert. Plants, animals, humans. He had come to know the Rimmel rhythm, the sands rhythm of the heat, and he had become an amateur of traditional Arabic desert poetry, in the form known as Nabati. Chalmers found him outdoors, in the midst of an impromptu, on-site construction meeting. Chalmers introduced himself. Kelvin asked for a couple minutes to finish up his meeting and then walked with Chalmers to CTF's site office. On the edge of a large clustered grid of site construction offices, Kelvin's office was upstairs in one of the 2-story stacked prefab modules. Inside, Kelvin offered a chair. Chalmers sat down and observed 2 noteworthy things on the walls. A series of large satellite images of the site, labeled "Taken Monthly," and a set of A0 size schedules of program versus actual, bar charts depicting all site construction and material procurement activities, updated weekly and heavily marked up with notes. As Kelvin sat down at his desk, Chalmers noticed a carved piece of rough wood, displayed like a nameplate plaque on the desk. It looked like a piece of an old, gnarly prosopis trunk, with one side cut smoothly, planed, and engraved. It was engraved with a quotation from Algernon Blackwood, and read, "The desert slipped in, through wall and ceiling, rising from beneath, settling about us, listening, pressing, waiting." Chalmers did not have time to think about it because Kelvin handed him a half-liter bottle of water and asked, "How can I help you?" Chalmers thanked Kelvin for his time and explained, "Toons asked me to get this landscape consultant and contractor team together. Have you been briefed?" "Certainly have, Chalmers, and I'd be glad to help if you need anything. We have 6 months to soft opening and no softscape action at all." "Yep, that's my task, Kelvin. I do have 2 questions. First, I'm going to be working directly with the landscape contractor and consultant. Time being so short, I really don't need or want to spend time with your contracted project management team. Unless you see essential value here on site, what do you say?" "Chalmers, they're paper pushers, so just stop in and see me with updates as appropriate, okay? On the landscaping, we need action, not talk." "Got it. Now, second, I need to get with the general contractor's construction manager to get some details. Then I will work on down the chain of command. I told Toons I would have an action plan by close of business this Thursday, so can you point me in the direction of the construction manager's office?" "The general contractor's CM? That would be Bob Rosenwinkel. His office is in the construction trailer next door, upstairs. And Chalmers, please keep me in the picture with the same info you share with Toons." Then pointing to some bright red highlighted bars on the bar chart schedule behind his desk, Kelvin emphasized, "This landscaping is way behind." Kelvin stood up as he finished speaking, looked out his window southwest into the mid-afternoon sun and dune landscape. Then he added, "By the way, I was just wondering, have you ever worked in these sand deserts before? Do you know what you're up against, Chalmers?" Chalmers blinked as the almost rhetorical question settled in. He waited for Kelvin to turn around. Then he answered, "There's nothing that compares to the empty quarter anywhere in the world. I'm sure we can agree on that. I have built a couple very large projects here in the UAE and worked on the edge of the Western Sahara before. But there is one rule that guides me, I can always learn more. So, if you will, please take a minute and share the observations that help drive you to succeed in this landscape. Calvin looked out the window again, at the empty quarter landscape, and while he thought, Calvin let silence control the room. Then, looking back at Chalmers, he shared, "There are 3,235 humans working out there today. They are housed and fully supplied with water and power, food, shelter, and air conditioning. All of this we are doing in a landscape that for centuries, millennia, likely never had 25 humans pass through it in a single year. Do you sense a disconnect?" Part 3. Morphogenetics. Calvin Isley was intent on giving Chalmers a proper introduction to the Liwa Qsar project landscape. He continued his explanation of disconnects. Contrary to the fine artwork, the craft of Western photographers and journalists, this landscape is first and foremost not about beauty, it is about death and the daily battle for survival. Survival of the fittest. He who adapts survives. Chalmers said, "I like the way you think. Historically, I understand this huge sand desert as a landscape of death, but in a contemporary sense, I'm not so sure." "I'm not surprised," said Calvin. "If you have another moment, I'll tell you what happened to me." "What do you mean, Calvin?" "Listen, Chalmers. I've been out here virtually every day for almost 2 years. I live out here, in a trailer cabin in an old date palm orchard, where we have a management camp. There are about 125 cabins in the camp, and, by the way, if, as I imagine, you plan on being out here every day, I can arrange a cabin for you too. No rush, we can arrange that later. But listen, I have made it a point to confront this desert landscape head on. You need only walk across 2 dune ridges, and you might as well be 200 kilometers away from the nearest human, the nearest water. And except for compass, which sometimes even loses its accuracy, and modern electronic wayfinding, there is 100% visual disorientation." Chalmers, showing interest in the story, looked inquisitively at Calvin. Calvin continued, "I carry a GPS beacon. It is as important as water, and I notify security in advance and have an established check-in protocol every 3 hours when I explore on foot." "That was my security, but that is not the story. Continue, Calvin. Tell me. I'm convinced the desert is alive with some kind of continuously modulating subtle energy. Anyone who has visited and carefully observed can easily see its restlessness, its subtle rhythm. Photographs belie it. They invariably portray a dune as a stable, seductively shaped form with which contemporary humans positively identify. It is the very still day that reveals oh so subtly its inherent energy, its own story. For me, it is very personal, very intimidating, very, I've concluded, otherworldly, yet I'm really not sure. You know, I walk these dunes, night, day, sunrise, sunset, midday. It was the midday, but it has happened more than once. The restlessness of the sands creeps out very slowly and very subtly on still days, maybe like a ground-hugging mist on the moors in northern England. You never see it actually emerge, or any signs of it until its fingers are slowly wriggling along the surface, with purpose or without purpose, always unknown and unforeseen. Scientists have made attempts to measure the subtlest changes in temperature, isotherms, and humidity and pressure isobars, to try to understand the subtle changes in conditions that immediately precede the visual presence of these smallest serpentine mist fingers crawling ever so slowly along the surface of the ground. Chalmers interrupted. "The science is interesting, Calvin, but I do have to go." "Now hang on, Chalmers. Please, give me another minute. Last summer, I was out at midday, a still day, going up and down the dunes on foot. I paused over the edge of a dune hollow. The heat in midday does not come solely from the sun above. It feels even more intense reflected up off the sand. That is normal any day. But on that day, I was completely engulfed by the extremely dry heat from all directions. I could feel it not just on my bare skin, but especially and even through my boots. I could feel it like the smallest tentacles had emerged from and swept over the sand to explore. They touched lightly at first, touching the soles of my feet, a pins and needles-like feeling, then reaching, grasping, tickling, tingling, seemingly searching at my ankles. My feet were anchored in the sand. In the midst of trying to think through and analyze this feeling, I felt the pins and needles from those tentacles reaching up my calves, exploring, grasping the sides of my knees. Each touch, each tickle felt like a probe for an open door, a probe for an entry. Each place touched became hotter and hotter through gradients, not just that medicinal dry heat that many enjoy when they step outside of an air-conditioned building into the desert heat, but a growing, a consuming heat that begs, at what point does too hot become a burn? I felt the pins and needles at my knee joints and ligaments, many pinpoints, many tickles, many picks, many probes. Time escaped me then. So many sensations consumed my senses. The next thing I knew, the increasing number of elongated tentacles and their searching, leading pins and needles points were grasping my thigh, and then at the inside of my thigh, toward where the leg meets the internal hip socket. It was all happening too fast. At the same time, the pins and needles tentacles, their tingles, their grasp quickly found, wrapped and tightened on my scrotum. Then my urethra, my anus, both simultaneously invaded. Entry had been found. Gates had been breached. My overloaded brain crashed. I collapsed. I must have lain in the sand for an hour, because the next I remembered was the security team, their ATVs, the shade netting, the IV, helping me recover from heat prostration. That's what they called it, heat prostration, right in the hollow where I fell. What I sensed and what I felt prior to losing consciousness left no bodily marks on me. Was it some kind of primitive morphogenetic process in action? I don't know, but while I still take my walks, the fear of an unknown now accompanies me out there every time. Chalmers, you are a landscape man. Let me suggest that before you finish this project, read from the pre-Islamic sources, the Mu'allaqat, about the desert genies. See what you can learn from the Liwa inhabitants about their interpretations of the Mu'allaqat and these strange sands. And the next time you see softly swirling sands in a gentle breeze, remember what has happened to me. Remember those softly swirling sands may be bringing you more than beauty. Chalmers did not know what to believe from this well-anchored and obviously dependable Kiwi. He had apparently been through some kind of macabre destabilization, some kind of surreal twilight zone, some kind of, landscape experience, and returned? Chalmers shuddered. He had to refocus on the project. I'd like to explore this further with you, Kelvin, but right now I need to see that construction manager, Rosenwinkel. Part 4. Bob Rosenwinkel. Chalmers was chomping at the bit to meet with the site construction manager. It was time to get this site situation into a proper project perspective. The general contractor's top man, the construction manager, was an American, Bob Rosenwinkel. His office was upstairs in the 2-story stacked prefab construction offices. His attractive female South African secretary, seeing that Chalmers was with CTF, said, "The door is open. Just go on in. No one else is with him now." Chalmers looked into the large room, about half the size of one full prefab construction office module, 4 or 5 times larger than a standard site construction office. Bob Rosenwinkel, dressed in a golf shirt and golf trousers, looking all ready for the first tee, was standing behind his executive-sized desk, looking out the large window at the construction site. The front half of the room had a large rectangular meeting table with 9 chairs. Against one side wall was an informal seating area with 2 sofas and a generous-sized coffee table, displaying a selection of large-format books on Sana'a, on Persia, and on the Arabian Peninsula. Then finally, in front of his desk, sat 3 more chairs. With the presence of construction samples, mock-ups, and models, a just beneath the surface electric tension, and the smell of working men in the desert, the office looked and felt like a construction manager's site office. He was the man in charge. But Rosenwinkel, Bob Rosenwinkel, his was a sad story. Bob Rosenwinkel was a Midwest American. Nearly 5 years ago, as his wife and 2 teenage daughters were on their way to visit him for the grand opening of a 5-star resort destination at Anguilla in the Caribbean, they disappeared. They were never found. They were presumed dead when their private flight from the last communication apparently crashed. There were no survivors, no black box, no nothing. He has carried on. At 5'9", 240 pounds, he had the look and build of a bull, a nearly immovable offensive center on an American football team. His brown hair was now age and stress flecked with gray. He kept it in a short pompadour style. He had successfully built famous skyscrapers in New York City and in the London Docklands before he began his international 5-star resort destination career. The Liwa Qsar project was his 6th resort destination, all massive, all complex, all uniquely themed, all honored by Condé Nast for both quality and success. He knew how to put a job together and how to finish it. And he, too, knew people. He used intimidation and anger as tools to motivate people who didn't motivate themselves. In his mid-50s, Bob had a puffy face, not gross but definitely tainted red from chronic high blood pressure. That complexion, coupled with his weight and 3 packs of cigarettes a day, all suggested his early retirement. And soon. Chalmers introduced himself. "Excuse me, Mr. Rosenwinkel. My name is Chalmers. I'm here from CTF to talk about external site finishes." Bob Rosenwinkel, with a welcoming, infectiously warm smile, reached out and shook Chalmers' hand and said, "Call me Bob. I heard you were coming. Nice to meet a fellow American. Come on in, Chalmers. Sit down." Chalmers said, "You seemed a bit distracted when I looked in." Bob answered, in his down-home Midwest American finest, "Yeah, I'm a fucking short-timer. I've been here in the desert for about 18 months now, 7 days a week with no time off. My dick is pointing to the DXB exit gate. I'll be in Bangkok this Sunday for a good hose down, and who knows after that." Bob's smooth, blade-shaven face had a thin, strong, Jackie Gleason kind of pencil mustache. With a Jackie Gleason over-the-top drama in his voice, he began, "Now what can I do for you?" Chalmers opened. "I've been told that the landscape consultant and the landscape subcontractor are getting nowhere. What's going on?" Chalmers had walked into Bob's game. "It's real simple. Your landscape consultant is a cunt, and your landscape contractor team are nothing but a bunch of fucking assholes." Taking the ride, Chalmers asked, "What do you mean, Bob?" Bob took a deep, long drag on his cigarette. He held the smoke in his lungs. Then, as he slowly rolled the cigarette between his fingers, he examined it. He slowly let the smoke out in the air above him, watched it dissipate, then looked back at the cigarette in his hand. He opened his eyes very wide, focused on Chalmers, and laid it out. "Look, when it comes to this work, there are only 3 kinds of people. Dicks who get the work done, cunts who get it done to them, and assholes who just get in the way." Steel gray eyes sparkling, Bob looked directly into Chalmers' eyes and got to the meat. "Now I'm going to have these buildings built, serviced, their 200 keys delivered, and they will be sitting in nothing but a pile of fucking sand. You CTF guys forced this consultant and contractor on us. Now you guys better fix it. You've got 6 months, Chalmers. Am I clear? Do you follow me?" Not for the first time, Chalmers felt the heat. He stood up, looked his countryman in the eyes, shook his hand, and finished with just one more question. "Yeah, I hear you. Where's the landscape subcontractor's site office?" Part 5. Marwan Abu Rashid. Things were shaping up now. In a project process sense, Chalmers saw nothing unusual in what he found from either Isley or Rosenwinkel. He knew he would have a free hand as long as he could assure improved adherence to schedule, accomplished work within the development budget, and steady progress toward a stunning opening day experience. 2 construction trailers over, on the ground floor, Chalmers entered and found a narrow central corridor with doors to 9 rooms and a toilet. Looking for the landscape sub, Chalmers walked down the corridor. The locating signs were A4 size paper printouts taped on all doors. He found 2 doors with landscaper signs. He stuck his head into one of the 2 landscaper rooms and asked for the project manager. They said, "Next door." Each landscaper room was about 4 meters by 4 meters, normal for site subcontractor offices. Each room was stuffed with 4 desks, chairs, a refrigerator, computers, routers, bookcase with shelves of files, reports messily scattered on all desktops, a plotter in one corner, a printer tucked into another, plans and papers everywhere on the floor. Each office had about 5 people squeezed into a space sized for 2. Low budget all the way, poor working conditions for sure. Chalmers introduced himself and politely asked to meet the project manager. If this was a typical hard and soft landscape construction office, it would have Lebanese in charge, with a handful of Syrians and Egyptians in support. That was the case. Mr. Marwan stood up, introduced himself, and asked one of his people to give up his chair for Chalmers. Marwan Abu Rashid was a grizzled Lebanese, in his mid-50s, 5'8", 195 heavy pounds, and more than a bit paunchy in the stomach from all those years of great Lebanese food. His graying, ruffled hair and stubble beard looked like he had just rolled out of bed after a 2-day binge. He was friendly and gentlemanly to meet, but he carried the underlying bitterness of a Lebanese who had had his country taken away from him by Western powers, by other outside powers, by regional politics. He had lost his homeland. He was of the diaspora, a Lebanese with no way home, except in his dreams. So, with his agricultural engineering degree from the American University in Beirut, he had made his expatriate living, building gardens and landscapes for rich clients, Saudis and Emiratis. Among friends, Marwan had long ago concluded that these clients were, for the most part, all just crude and tasteless Bedouins, without the culture and the class of the worldly cosmopolitan Lebanese. The Lebanese who for millennia, starting with the Phoenicians, had been the keepers of culture in the eastern Mediterranean basin. Marwan was happy to make as much money as possible by skimping and skimming on every aspect of the job to plump up his own retirement, which he hoped would be a peaceful place in the foothills of the Cedar Forest Mountains of Lebanon, just a short drive outside of Beirut. Marwan offered cooled bottled water, and they sat down to talk while the office continued around them. For one of the most prestigious contracting firms in Riyadh and throughout all of Saudi Arabia, Marwan had worked for 25 years building landscapes and gardens. Here at Liwa, he was responsible for all the hardscape and softscape. He was quite proud that the hardscape was pretty close to being on schedule. He was also proud that all the requisite India quarried sandstone was either on site or en route. But on the subject of softscape, he was defensive, evasive. He and Chalmers talked about the climate here in the empty quarter versus Riyadh and the Red Sea. They talked about site water availability and quality. It was the local season to be planting date palms. Marwan had 1,000 date palms to plant, and none of them had been planted yet. He complained that the general contractor had not made any areas available to him. Chalmers told him that was no surprise. Every job site was that way. Pushing hard, Chalmers said to Marwan, "Possession of site areas among subcontractors is like a rugby scrum. If you do not grab the ball, the other side will not hand it to you. It's your job to win or lose. Grab it, Marwan. You've got to make this happen." Marwan looked distracted. Chalmers continued, "So, have you sourced the palms? Have they been approved for quality?" Marwan, in an encouraging and confident way, replied, "Not to worry. There are plenty. I've planted thousands in Saudi Arabia, and I will do a first-class job here." Despite hearing a gentlemanly tone, Chalmers heard the evasion and sensed a growing dissonance in Marwan's air. They did some quick math and found that Marwan would need to be planting 200 date palms per week right now to finish the planting before the hottest of the summer arrived. Marwan said, "I will bring as many palms and people as required." Chalmers had been through this before. The words meant nothing. He would have to push and cajole this one home. The bottom line was that Marwan might get everything in the ground the night before opening day, but it would be straggly, messy, under stress. It would never pass for a 5-star A-lister party opening with all leading Emiratis in attendance. Chalmers asked, "What about the 200,000 trees, shrubs, and ground covers for the project? Have the shop drawings been submitted and approved? Have the plants been procured? Have they been approved? Are they in a hardening off program already, so they'll be ready for planting at the end of the hottest season?" Marwan, confident and gentlemanly as before, replied with no specificity, "Not to worry, the plants are at the nursery." Chalmers, continuing to apply the pressure, said, "At the nursery? Okay. How about we meet at the nursery tomorrow with your horticultural specialist and look at samples, check quantities for all the required plants?" Feeling the pressure, Marwan, with his gentlemanly overtone of insolence, said, "Okay, we can meet there tomorrow at 10 a.m. The nursery is just outside Abu Dhabi. I'll tell our nursery manager." They agreed. Chalmers, taking the nursery manager's contact details to confirm the route to the nursery, then shook hands with Marwan, thanking him for his hospitality, and said goodbye. Chalmers' meetings were finished for the day. He had found no shelter out here. Amongst the people, their personalities, and the desert itself, Chalmers now had both feet stuck. He was knee-deep into the mashup.